This video is part of an ongoing series on the original works of David Lynch, starting with Eraserhead and ending with Twin Peaks: The Return. This video will focus on Twin Peaks: Fire Walk With Me, but will definitely include spoilers for the other Twin Peaks media and may also include spoilers for Lynch's other films. A lot of the themes I'll be discussing on Fire Walk With Me are continued from my analysis on the original Twin Peaks, and a lot of the context from my perspective are introduced in the introduction video for this series. These will be linked in the description and will help to clarify a lot of context that may or may not be reiterated in this video. This video is also supported by Patreon pledges, so if you like this video and would like to support this ongoing series and other videos, please consider joining my Patreon. Every cent is highly appreciated. Twin Peaks: Fire Walk With Me is a deeply misunderstood film, or at least it was historically. Since its release, it was polarizing and it took a long time for its image to eventually be rehabilitated. It's a serious contender for my favorite film of all time, but I don't know how I would have felt if I had seen it for the first time back in 1992 when it was first released. One can speculate endlessly about why it didn't do well with fans of the show or critics at the time, but it goes without saying that if you watch the Twin Peaks show and then watch Fire Walk With Me, it becomes clear that there is a sharp contrast between what the show was and what the movie would be. This contrast is clearly deliberate in a way that had to have been off-putting for many, and the brutally grim tone of the film likely put off those who were strictly there for a follow-up to Twin Peaks. Fire Walk With Me is one of Lynch's most important films because it's the turning point between his early career and his later career. His early career was marked by more straightforward narratives, punctuated by brief moments of surrealism, as was the case with The Elephant Man, Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart, and the original Twin Peaks show. These works often centered men as protagonists and assumed a masculine perspective throughout. Lynch's later career often sought to undermine masculine perspectives and men as protagonists and heroes, and experimented more heavily with storytelling, often using fractured, multi-narrative stories with notable meta-references and more frequent surreal imagery. It goes without saying that the likes of Inland Empire and Lost Highway were a bit of a far cry from the likes of Blue Velvet. Fire Walk With Me presents the major turning point in that regard. And Fire Walk With Me also represents a major turning point in central characters, as it was the first project of Lynch's with a woman as the main protagonist, and wouldn't be his last. The ending of Twin Peaks led to a shift in priorities for Lynch. Male-centered perspectives in the likes of Dale Cooper were over. In its place were often feminist stories told from women's perspectives. In the case of Fire Walk With Me, our primary protagonist is that of the ever-mysterious Laura Palmer. Laura Palmer is a contradiction. She's at once a good girl, a homecoming queen, and benevolent Meals on Wheels contributor to the town of Twin Peaks, while at the same time being a bad girl, a cocaine-addicted, sex-trafficked prostitute with her finger in the pots of several bad goings-on in the town. Laura is a great, mysterious character in the show, and a lot of people were initially very unreceptive towards Fire Walk With Me, in part because it seemed to remove a lot of the mystery of the character and her tragic death at the hands of her father. But I don't think Fire Walk With Me resolved the mystery, and here's why. The mystery of Laura Palmer is rooted heavily in the contradiction at the core of her character. She exists on the precipice of two worlds, both literally and figuratively, and the contradiction of light and dark within her, as well as how she balances and lives with this contradiction, is what makes the mystery of her character so compelling. And that contradiction isn't resolved in Fire Walk With Me. Instead, it's explored in further depths than the show would ever go. It's important to understand Fire Walk With Me as Laura's story within the context of the larger universe of the show. I don't mean that only literally in that the film chronicles their last days. I mean that in terms of the meaning of the series. A lot of the meaning of the entire series hinges on details that are introduced in Fire Walk With Me, many of which are substantiated and given clarity in The Return 25 years later. And at the center of all of it is the story of Laura Palmer. Laura Palmer's story, as presented in Fire Walk With Me, is the thread connecting the entire series, in terms of its story, universe, and lore, in terms of its spiritual, interpersonal, and political elements, in terms of the broader context of existentialist philosophy, critique of American power structures, and much more. Laura is the one. This video will cover the following. First, I'll recap some of the themes I discussed in my Twin Peaks original series videos that will be relevant to Fire Walk With Me. Then, I'll discuss the Deer Meadow and Philadelphia sections of the film and how they relate to the broader themes of the film, as well as how they connect to Laura's story. After that, I'll discuss the big picture of Laura's story and the themes of severe parental abuse and the contradictory nature of light and dark within Laura. Then, I'll discuss some of the weirder details of the film and cross-reference them with both the old show and The Return. Those weirder details include the fan in the Palmer house, electricity, the jade ring, the strange apparitions that appear throughout the film, most especially Bob, the moments pertaining to Dale trapped in the Black Lodge, Garmin Bosia, and perhaps other details as well. I'll finish by discussing the sort of existential confusion and crisis of the film and a broader tonal atmosphere of rot and decay that feels almost cosmic in nature, and tie it into colonialism, capitalism, environmentalism, and existential philosophy. If you're coming here from my Twin Peaks original series videos, then I hope you'll enjoy continuing this long journey with me into Twin Peaks, and if you're new, then welcome, and I hope you'll enjoy starting this journey with me into Twin Peaks. Let's begin. Twin Peaks is a show with a largely existentialist outlook on the world. When one is confronted with the reality of their own mortality and the absurdity of existence, self-actualization, also known as the action of achieving a sense of unique purpose, value, and meaning, is the goal if one wishes to avoid abject despair. Put more simply, everyone's going to die someday, so we better make every day count. Laura's death showcases the existential crisis that her town of Twin Peaks faces. Her death is an act of complete objectification, and this failure opens the town of Twin Peaks to have to face its own demons, which are spiritual, interpersonal, and political. The town is permeated by literal spiritual entities that also exist as signifiers in the narrative of the show. Characters like Bob, the man from another place, or the White Horse exist primarily to suggest something by virtue of how they interact with specific characters. Bob, for example, exists to reveal the evil within Leland to those who he shows as evil too, which is best demonstrated by the scene where he kills Maddie. Twin Peaks is also representative of a cultural trend in the United States at the time of the show's release towards 1950s traditionalism, exemplified by pre-feminist and pre-civil rights suburban gender and race relations. To make this clearer, Twin Peaks as a town is a microcosm of American nostalgia for the traditions of a white, heterosexual nuclear family that was created in the 1950s during the post-World War II economic boom. This kind of antiquated lifestyle was being promoted in the 80s by Republicans starting with Reagan, and was used to cover up a lot of corruption going on in both the 50s and the 80s. The culture of the town of Twin Peaks is reflective of a specific fondness for the notion of small-town America, but this same narrative helps to obscure the ongoing abuse and deep unhappiness that a lot of the town's citizens, especially the women, are facing. In this sense, Twin Peaks is an existentialist feminist piece about women and men needing to work together to overcome patriarchal traditions and develop egalitarian, mutually beneficial relationships in order to fight against a culture that repeatedly puts women into uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous situations. Twin Peaks also plays the spiritual and surrealist elements in a meta way, using surrealism as a means of changing the story at will to reflect production changes. Thus, the show is sort of approaching breaking the fourth wall and promoting skepticism of media's perpetuation of narratives that encourage the sort of traditional American culture that harms women through patriarchal control. The spiritual and meta elements of the show are encouraging viewers to consider the existential questions that the show presents as it would apply to our own life, as well as to create a sense of awe and mystery that makes us more aware of deeper questions than simply the story directly in front of us. Lastly, I brought up a concept in my Twin Peaks video that I referred to as competing narratives. This is just my way of phrasing a concept that I see in Lynch's work in general and especially in Twin Peaks, which is a tension in his work between different viewpoints and perspectives. This both applies to the storytelling notion of a narrative, as in the film has two stories that conflict with one another in some way, and the more sociological notion of a social narrative, like the narrative of Dale Cooper as a heroic figure, a viewpoint that we cast on people, situations, and cultural phenomena. Postmodern theory is all about the tension between different narratives and the power imbalances that these different narratives cause. An example, which we'll discuss later, is that of Leland as an abusive father who exploits Laura versus the idea that Leland is a good person who is corrupted by the demon Bob. The story never makes either officially true over the other, but which one you believe to be true will determine how you understand his character and the story involving him. As well, these two viewpoints will affect the way people in the town of Twin Peaks will view him. Again, this is best represented by the scene in the original show where Leland kills Maddie. Maddie is awakening to the side of Leland that the rest of the town doesn't see. If you believe Bob is at fault for the mistreatment of Laura, then you're less likely to read, for example, the scene where he cries and apologizes to Laura as manipulative. But if you believe that Bob is really just symbolic of some evil within Leland, then you might read the same scene as Leland being manipulative or sociopathic. The narrative that you adopt about a film or about a character, about a person or group, will impact how you perceive and then interact with that particular film, character, person, or group. I feel like Lynch was approaching this sort of duality of who someone is in the season 2 finale, Beyond Life and Death. The doppelgangers that appear in that episode are indicative not just of a dark side to a person, but an alternative version of that person entirely. The abject despair that one has to fight against in order to embrace an existentialist philosophy is reflected in the doppelgangers, who represent the worst potential within a person. Dale's doppelganger isn't Bob. Dale's doppelganger is an alternate version of Dale who embraces the evil that Bob represents. Twin Peaks explores these tensions between differing narratives, but postmodern theory specifically suggests that a dominant narrative or grand narrative becomes to permeate our thinking. Such grand narratives are rooted in social and linguistic power structures, and postmodern theory suggests skepticism of allowing any narrative to be a grand narrative. A postmodern look at Twin Peaks would reject any singular interpretation of the series as truth, and instead seek to find nuggets of truth within any interpretation. It would promote skepticism of grand narratives, but would evaluate differing narratives and the tensions between. That's what I hope to do in this video, though I want to put forward my personal interpretation in the process. Don't think of my outlook on the film as definitive or me trying to figure Lynch out. My goal is to look at Fire Walk with Me, along with all of Lynch's work, through a certain lens, with postmodern and feminist theories in mind, to try to make sense of the text, but not to explain it. I don't want to control the narrative of Fire Walk with Me, I want to understand it. So I hope to share Fire Walk with Me as I personally understand it. Is that clear enough? Alright. If you haven't seen my video on Twin Peaks and this all sounds a bit much, I again remind you to please check out that video for further elaboration on those themes, because I don't want to reiterate the entire previous video here. With all of this in mind, we can discuss Fire Walk with Me as a continuation and elaboration of those themes. One of the first scenes of Fire Walk with Me involves Gordon showing our new characters, FBI agents Chet Desmond and Sam Stanley, a woman named Lil wearing a red dress with a blue rose. This scene, I think, has taken on more significance among Twin Peaks fans than it has for me personally. Really, the scene mostly just introduces the blue rose concept, which we learn about later in The Return. Let's look at the scene. Lil is wearing all red except a blue rose. She's doing a lot of strange things, which Chet later clarifies the meaning of. But Sam Stanley is asked about the one thing that's missing from what Chet tells Sam, and that's the significance of the blue rose. Chet says he can't reveal what the blue rose is. We later learn in The Return that the first blue rose case involved a woman being murdered by another woman who appeared to be the same woman. The woman who was murdered before dying said, "I'm like the blue rose," before disappearing into thin air. The significance of the blue rose is that it's not something that occurs naturally. It's an enigma of nature. Blue rose is a code word for paranormal, supernatural, or inexplicable events that occur in the world of Twin Peaks. In a more general sense, blue rose is a reference to mysteries without clear explanations. So the blue rose on Lil is a reference to an investigation into inexplicable events relating to Teresa Banks' death. It could also be seen as a reference to Laura Palmer later on in the film. The important thing isn't the symbolism, but how it exists as a signifier in the scene. The contrast between a red dress and a blue rose causes our eyes to immediately go to the blue rose. It's the central mysterious presence in an otherwise already somewhat mysterious situation. We overtly notice Lil, but our subconscious notices the blue rose almost immediately due to the sharp contrast. The blue rose is a signifier of the unexplainable details, the enigmas that immediately draw our attention and almost sort of beg us to look further. In the pilot of Twin Peaks, the blue rose was Laura in this regard. The contrast of the mundane life of the town of Twin Peaks, the sudden, mysterious, brutal murder of Laura, and subsequently the disturbing image of her objectified, brutalized corpse, is the mystery the eyes can't avoid and the subconscious can't ignore. It's the thing that motivated us to want to know more in the first place. So in this regard, the blue rose phrasing and concept is really mostly a reference to the mysteries of the world that provoke us to need to know more. There isn't one singular thing that the blue rose represents, but the blue rose is an object in which its nature reflects the nature of many, many mysteries throughout the series. The Blue Rose Task Force is a task force that's expressed purpose is to seek the answers to mysteries that lie far beyond that of the simple lives that most folks live. Deer Meadow is the anti-Twin Peaks in a lot of regards. This is partially tonal in nature, as it helps set the tone for the film and contrast it to the show by suggesting that a lot of the things we associate with the show aren't here. It's also thematic, both in that it prepares us for the deliberate contrast and messaging from the show, and in that Deer Meadow stands at a thematic contrast from the town of Twin Peaks in order to expand on themes already established in the show. Deer Meadow is a sort of small-town hell to Twin Peaks' small-town heaven. It's bleak, it seems to exist in a state of abject poverty, the people who run the town are corrupt, and the people who live there are confused, lost, and agitated. This town represents another side of the small-town imagery of the original show, that of the trailer trash part of America. Keep in mind that the town of Twin Peaks in the original show is sort of a stereotype of small-town America that must have already been popular in the 80s and continues onward to today, one of a simplicity away from the hustle and bustle of life in the postmodern world. But Deer Meadow is a sort of inverted stereotype, that of the bumfuck nowhere town, a place where there is nothing of value and nobody to share it with. Deer Meadow, as a part of the world of Twin Peaks, is what it looks like when the American dream crashes, burns, and dies a horrible death. It's what it looks like when there is no upward mobility of class, no aspirations, no hope or optimism, and no community prosperity through collective value. In terms of the themes relating to capitalism in America and Twin Peaks, Deer Meadow is what it looks like when capitalism parasitically rots away a local area for the benefit of the few. There's a word for this: sacrifice zones. Sacrifice zones are local areas in which the economy or environment has been so wrecked and destroyed, often by capitalism, but sometimes by other means such as war or governmental actions, that it becomes borderline uninhabitable. Picture Pripyat, Ukraine as an extreme example. The important thing is this feeling of hopeless, abject despair as induced by people with power and reverberating through the minds and spirits of those who continue to inhabit the area. In this way, Deer Meadow is not just an example of contrasting images of Twin Peaks, but the economy of Twin Peaks as well. Deer Meadow is economically damned and it shows. It's reminiscent of small desert towns in Southern California and Nevada, which I've driven through several times. It's the kind of place nobody stops at, but many see while driving on the West Coast. While small towns like Twin Peaks can sometimes flourish with a bustling local economy driven in part by the logging industry and in part by Ben's hotels, a town like Deer Meadow appears to be falling apart at the seams, and the economic contrast is important here. I'll discuss the economics angle in a later section as well. Deer Meadow is a reflection of a larger societal rejection and exploitation, and this is important in order to show the side of small-town America that Twin Peaks failed to really convey. But it's also important in order to show a contrast specifically between Laura Palmer and Teresa Banks. As I said in my video on Blue Velvet, Laura Palmer is sort of the Dorothy Valens that didn't get away, a girl so utterly destroyed by patriarchal power dynamics that it robbed her of her very life. But she still had goodness in her heart and goodness in her life. Teresa Banks, on the other hand, had no goodness in her life. She lived in a town where life doesn't matter, where life has been treated with contempt or indifference, where those who live don't really live much at all. She lived in a town where nobody would care if she lived or died, and she lived that way and she died that way. Deer Meadow helps establish an important piece of the meaning of Twin Peaks. Your environment affects who you are and how you live. If your environment fosters hope and well-being, then you reflect this back into your world. But if your environment fosters rot, decay, and despair, then this will be all you see. Indeed, in Fire Walk With Me, this is what Laura sees in her town, just as it's what Teresa experiences in Deer Meadow. Twin Peaks is an idyllic, small-town sheen that obscures a dark underbelly. Deer Meadow has nothing to obscure, it's all underbelly. And this environment is why Teresa Banks was allowed to die and have it mean nothing to anyone. The film comments on the sad, bleak, existential loss that Teresa Banks represents by showing how the world around her failed her so brutally as to not even notice the difference when she was gone. Deer Meadow exists as an opposite in other ways as well. The sheriff and local police are rotten, horrible people, the waitress at the diner is an old, bitter woman, and the town, at least what we see of it, seems to primarily be composed of people living in poverty and trailers. This contrast helps fill out the important pieces of Teresa Banks' puzzle. No law enforcement to protect her, no local connections to help pull her away from the advances of Leland, no economic ladder to help her pull herself out of poverty and no longer have to resort to prostitution. Her death is a reflection of the life she lived, and the life she lived is a reflection of the circumstances in which she was made to live. This is what happens when no one cares, when the world fails you. Chet Desmond stands at a contrast to both Laura and Dale. Focusing on Dale first, Chet's whole characterization is, in line with the Deer Meadow section of the film, sort of the anti-Dale. Whereas Dale is very charming, warm, and empathetic, Chet is charmless, cold, and deterministic in a way that stands at a stark contrast to Dale's general go-with-the-flow demeanor. But the two aren't exact opposites. They both fit an archetype of the male heroic figure, in this case specifically the role of the detective solving a mystery. Within this archetype are traits that are positively associated with masculinity present in both men: cunning, determination, quick perception, skill in physical combat, and a tight heart that responds coolly to intimidation and aggression. Importantly, the archetype of Dale as a heroic figure and the more humanizing qualities that make him such a delight are not necessarily linked. Both are positively associated with masculinity, but the archetype need not be positive in order to have those positive associations. This is what Chet Desmond exists for. In terms of cultural narratives about men, and particularly about men as heroic figures in media, Chet Desmond fits the archetype to a T just as Dale does. But his charmlessness and the way in which his behavior and demeanor directly tonally contrast with Dale in the first 2 seasons calls into question the archetype itself. Is it fair, is it good, to assume that these things that make Dale a hero also make him a good person? Is it fair to associate these archetypal traits with goodness in men? Is Chet good just because he's ostensibly working for the right team? Is he good because of his skills? Or is there something missing in him that is present in Dale that constitutes goodness? Certainly, some of the traits that make Chet fit the archetype of the hero are true of villainous characters in Twin Peaks. Leo, Leland, Ben, these characters also have qualities of being able to respond coolly to intimidation, determination, and others. If these traits can be used to harm, then they are at best neutral and at worst a detriment. So the Deer Meadow section of the film is not just about contrasting Twin Peaks as a town, but about contrasting Chet with Dale. Chet is, initially, in the hero role, the protagonist of the Deer Meadow section, but his role is in a context that changes its meaning. Earlier, I spoke on competing narratives as a concept. The tension between two narratives is a point of discussion because of the way in which they compete for prevalence. If you believe, for example, that Diane is the real Betty of Mulholland Drive, then you might have a very different interpretation than if you believe that Betty is the real Diane. Indeed, both are possible, but what's more important than the answer to that ambiguity is the ambiguity itself. Why do these two narratives exist in tension with one another? So let's apply that same thinking to Fire Walk With Me. The first narrative section of the film is all prior to Laura's arrival in the narrative. I call it the Deer Meadow section, but it includes Philadelphia and Dale Cooper. Where is the point of tension? Well, it all goes back to Chet. As Chet is about to have a breakthrough on the case of what happened to Teresa Banks, he vanishes, as if plucked directly from the world of Twin Peaks itself. This is, again, the meta of the series affecting the plot, a sort of deus ex machina. But why does he disappear? He disappears for 2 reasons, in my opinion. First is so that Phillip Jeffries can appear. Second is so that we can begin to set the stage finally for Laura's story. Think about Chet's disappearance as akin to Betty discovering the blue box in Mulholland Drive. It is the crucial point which allows both Lynch and the audience to begin to shift narrative focus to a new story, this one involving Laura. But why do it this way at all? Well, first, it functions as a point of critique of narratives of male heroic figures. Although we know that Chet ultimately doesn't find anything or do anything to save Laura, there's still a part of me, and perhaps other viewers as well, that wants to see him do something of importance in the narrative. I just want to reach to the screen and tell him where Laura is so he can go and save her or something. Indeed, Chet's being plucked from the narrative forces us to deal with what his story tells us, which is, to me at least, that Chet is not our hero. As we will learn in the next section, neither is Dale. In this way, the Deer Meadow section serves in part as self-critique. Chet is the anti-Dale in order to cast doubt on the heroic narrative constructed about Dale by the original show. In Laura's story, there are no men who come to her rescue. Instead, they all fail her. And just as Bobby is a failure when it comes to saving Laura or helping her towards a better life, Chet is a sort of archetypal failure. If Laura is the Dorothy that didn't escape Frank, then Chet is the Jeffrey who didn't intervene. As well, so too is Dale. Dale doesn't save Laura, but unlike Chet, Dale has a chance to learn from this failure, which is what we see in the original show. Effectively, this section is saying that the traits that make Chet heroic are not the things that will save people like Laura. It's not about what skills you have, it's about what's in your heart. And while Chet isn't necessarily heartless, his behavior reflects a very non-empathetic, callous, and toxic way of viewing the world that indicates why he is so different from Dale. Dale does well because he cares and because he wants to do good for people. Another important point of consideration is that the series has a broader message about community. Chet is an embodiment of a very individualistic view of goodness. If he were to save Laura, then the message the film would be sending is that the problem is individual. The right person in the right place at the right time can fix a whole world of problems. We see in The Return that this idea isn't a correct way of viewing the world or the story of the show. Indeed, it's a system, a culture, a series of interpersonal connections that fails Laura and Teresa, and one man can't fix that. We have to all work to fix it collectively. In this way, Chet's disappearance also reflects the flaws in viewing the world through simplistic narratives of individualism and individual power. Otherwise, if Chet, or Dale, or Bobby, or any one person could just save Laura or save Teresa, then the moral message of the series becomes little more than the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Blue Velvet effectively carried that exact message, and so Fire Walk With Me functions again as a sort of self-critique for Lynch. If one of the central themes of the show is how goodness fosters goodness and cruelty fosters cruelty, Chet's problem is that he fosters cruelty. Another central theme is that all people are a reflection of the environment around them, and Chet reflects Deer Meadow. A broken place gets a broken hero. Importantly, and this isn't substantiated until The Return, the real quote-unquote hero of Deer Meadow is Carl. Carl's an example of a good man and a good person. Empathetic, takes care of local people, kind, able to coexist with different kinds of people, sees goodness in others. Carl lives in dire circumstances but still finds a way to keep goodness in his heart. A second reason why Chet disappears is so that the film can lay the foundation for Laura's story. Laura has no hope, no reason to live, or no sense of existential purpose. These things couldn't simply be granted by one man appearing at the right time and right place and executing the right moves. It totally undermines the masculine-centric perspective of typical stories about women like Laura and of Twin Peaks prior, priming the audience for a new story to unfold that centers Laura. Indeed, if we go purely off what the show was before, the show centered around Dale Cooper. Dale was our portal into this world. In a way, he still is in Fire Walk With Me. But that sort of becomes a problem for telling Laura's story, because in order to humanize a dehumanized character, we have to work against the aspects of her dehumanization present in the narrative itself. And that means shifting away from the men as heroes model, which makes the Deer Meadow section all the more succinct, in that it allows Lynch to give people what they expect to want, and then critique that thing and suggest that no, we don't really want that. We don't want Laura's story to be Blue Velvet too, because her humanity isn't dependent solely on her survival. Instead, what makes her story so affecting is the trauma she was forced to endure, and the Deer Meadow section of the film allows the film to simultaneously expand upon some of the lore leading up to her death, while also using it as a chance to critique the gendered meanings of the show, which we will inevitably bring into our view of the film. All in all, the Deer Meadow story is a story of Teresa Banks' world failing her, while also being a story of how our world fails towns like Deer Meadow, while also being a critique of cultural narratives about men and especially men in media, while also serving as both a tonal contrast and a thematic counterpoint to the original Twin Peaks show. Let's move on and discuss the Philadelphia section of the film. Dale Cooper says in the original show that when there are two events that occur simultaneously relating to the same object of inquiry, that we must always pay strict attention. When Chet Desmond mysteriously disappears after attempting to grab the jade ring under Mrs. Chalfont's trailer, time appears to stop, and Phillip Jeffries appears in Philadelphia, despite being in Buenos Aires. Two events occur simultaneously pertaining to the same object of inquiry. Phillip Jeffries is, unlike Bob or the Man from Another Place, not really an apparition or spirit entity or whatever you want to call them. He's a real person. Despite this, he manages to be in two places at the same time and delivers a strange, ominous message. A good starting point for understanding his role is to determine whether or not he's a good or bad figure. In my opinion, he's a good figure in the sense that he's a character who's working for the right team. We see in The Return that he's working against Mr. C and for Dale, which to me is enough to suggest that Philip's motivations are pure. Phillip Jeffries begins Lynch down a long line of tradition of weird characters that appear suddenly in the narrative at a crucial point, simultaneously serving as a warning and shifting the nature of the narrative in the process. He's like the mystery man or the cowboy in this regard. There are 6 major points of interest in regards to Phillip Jeffries before we can finally move onward to Laura's story. I'll list them and then elaborate individually. 1. Cooper's weird camera trick. 2. Phillip Jeffries appearing at the same time that Chet Desmond disappears. 3. Jeffries saying, "Who do you think that is there?" while pointing at Dale. 4. Jeffries stating, "We live inside a dream." 5. Jeffries discussing the place above the convenience store. 6. Jeffries' connection to Laura's story and to Laura herself. Okay, so first, Cooper's weird camera trick. Cooper walks in front of the security camera several times before he finally does so while Jeffries walks in. Cooper said that he was worried today because of the dream he told Gordon about, and the dream appears to involve the security cameras. This is important. Cooper had a premonition about Jeffries' appearance and it having something to do with the camera. When Jeffries walks in, Cooper stands in front of the security camera, then walks up to the monitor to see himself staring back at him in the camera. They're in some kind of suspended dream state. If you ask me, this image evokes a few thoughts. First, there are two Dales. We learn at the end of Season 2 that Cooper has been overtaken by a doppelganger and the good Dale is trapped in the Black Lodge, as Annie says in Fire Walk With Me. This image already evokes the image of two Dales, surreally reminding us of the fact that we last left off with Dale trapped in the Black Lodge. Second, it reminds me of Part 17 of The Return. There, we see Dale staring directly at the camera, directly at us, the audience, as if breaking the fourth wall. If you were to stare closely at a TV screen and then turn that screen off, you would see in the black void nothing but the pale image of your own face. We see exactly this happen in Part 17. The screen goes dark as if the show itself has been turned off, and we see Dale's face as if in the reflection of a powered-off TV screen. Dale is forced in this moment to confront some aspect of his reality, and in this same scene, Dale utters the phrase, "We live inside a dream," which is also stated in the scene where Dale meets Phillip Jeffries in Fire Walk With Me. Importantly as well, when Dale finally leaves Twin Peaks, he does so again through a meeting with Phillip Jeffries. Just as Jeffries shifted the narrative upon his arrival in Fire Walk With Me, he does so again in The Return. So clearly there's a connection between these two scenes, and I want to go a step further and say that Dale staring into the camera is very similar to Dale staring into the fourth wall in The Return. Both these scenes seem to involve some sort of break with both time and space. In both scenes, time seems to freeze, and in both scenes, a character is able to be in two places simultaneously. It's important not to think of the story as existing in any sort of linear chronology. Chronology is only real as it's experienced in the moment by any given character. So what I mean by that is, look at Annie's role in the materials after the original series. In Fire Walk With Me, she appears from the future into the quote-unquote past of Laura's life, and relays the message that the good Dale is trapped in the Black Lodge. In The Return, Annie's message appears to have been transcribed by Laura and is read by Frank, Truman, and Hawk, suggesting that the ability to jump around in time and space, and the ability for people to exist simultaneously in two places at once, is part of the canon of the show. What I'm getting to is that Dale is currently in the Black Lodge and in Philadelphia in this scene, and it's this momentary lapse in time and space that allows Dale to begin to confront his reality. His future as a man trapped in the Black Lodge while his evil doppelganger roams free, as well as the reality that within him exists two Dales, one of whom is capable of extreme cruelty. The camera trick visually allows Dale to confront himself and the broader circumstances of his reality, while also serving as a neat way to suggest that time and space are beginning to break down, allowing Phillip Jeffries to make his entrance. As far as Jeffries appearing at the same time as Chet disappearing, I think this is important in terms of the narrative shift away from Deer Meadow and towards Laura's story, as well as a broader narrative shift in Twin Peaks as a series, away from existing within the confines of a quote-unquote reality of the show, and into a more abstract state of unreality. Lynch loves playing with notions of reality and unreality in his work. In Eraserhead, the film begins firmly in the place of the unreal. Henry, suspended in outer space, is clearly a man divorced from the quote-unquote real world. Lynch's later work would experiment a lot more with bending the rules of fiction in order to evoke a sense of unreality, and well before Twin Peaks he had already begun to explore this idea in Ronnie Rocket. Ronnie Rocket is primarily about existentialism and uses the crushing existential anxiety of the vastness and incomprehensibility of the universe and one's own individual place in it, in order to suggest that one can sort of transcend this into a better state of being. It's a more optimistic ending than Eraserhead, but born of similar principles, and Lynch explores these principles throughout his work. Twin Peaks mostly took place in a basic real world with some nods to surrealism, but primarily there was a clear canon and a clear, direct sense of what was happening. That all changed with the Season 2 finale, in which Dale was forced to confront a deeper existential question of his own individual humanity in the face of a vast and incomprehensible universe. The ending of Twin Peaks borrows a little from Ronnie Rocket, and The Return borrows quite a bit from it, but Beyond Life and Death was just a start towards Lynch rejecting traditional storytelling altogether. Anyways, as far as Fire Walk With Me is concerned, Dale, Laura, and Phillip Jeffries are at three different states of knowledge and understanding. Dale has yet to come to terms with a lot of bigger questions that he's forced to confront in Beyond Life and Death. Phillip's appearance at the same time as Chet's disappearance is a pivotal moment for Dale, who's beginning to be confronted with bigger ideas than he's ready to comprehend, including the multiple Dales within himself and the notion that we live inside a dream. Now, the next 2 points I brought up are connected. Jeffries saying, "Who do you think that is there?" while mentioning Dale, and the "we live inside a dream" line. Jeffries seems to be potentially aware that Dale has a doppelganger. This is interesting because Dale has yet to enter the Black Lodge, so it implies that Jeffries has the ability to see into the future. We see in The Return, Gordon discusses this memory as though it were a dream, suggesting that he had forgotten about it for a long. Indeed, Jeffries commenting on Dale seems to allude to his future being trapped in the Black Lodge, which to me actually says more about Jeffries than it does Dale. As far as Dale is concerned, Jeffries is casting doubt on Dale as a heroic figure, suggesting that there's some evilness within him that might be lying dormant. But as far as Jeffries is concerned, his knowledge that Dale is, in the future, trapped in the Black Lodge means that Jeffries is much further ahead in his investigation into Blue Rose cases than the other Blue Rose task force members. This is important for a reason. As various characters search for some deeper meaning, purpose, or understanding to the world, they come face to face with a number of supernatural occurrences that muddy the waters as far as the characters' ethics are concerned, as well as pose serious threats to the characters. Jeffries is later turned into a tea kettle, as if his attempts to gain a deeper understanding of the world has altered him so significantly as if to rob him of his basic humanity. I mean, certainly, this kind of knowledge could arguably turn one into a god, and looking back down on humanity after attaining deeper knowledge of our reality like that could be very difficult. This is sort of the point, that the quest for deeper knowledge can, for better or worse, often remove one from their basic connection to fellow human beings. Ambitious though it may be, it's not without consequence, and Jeffries is sort of the proverbial Icarus in that way. He reached for the stars and he got burned, or rather, got turned into a tea kettle. This is why Jeffries says we live inside a dream. This exact phrase is echoed later when Dale says it towards the end of The Return. Dale is becoming aware of some deeper, more intangible aspect to his universe, and it's causing a sort of psychological split from the reality in front of him. He can't share this basic human moment of reconnecting with all his loved ones, because he can't view this moment divorced from the harrowing and vast knowledge he has developed from his time in the Black Lodge. His attempts to figure out the deeper parts of reality beyond what anyone can comprehend have altered him, but unlike Jeffries, he kept his humanity intact. Jeffries is, effectively, where Dale would later be in The Return, in the Philadelphia scene. He's already been forced to confront his own unreality, and is trying to wake other characters up to it, but they're not ready to hear it yet. He's planting the seeds for Gordon to figure it out 25 years later, and for Dale to figure it out at the end of Season 2, with 25 years to process this knowledge before his re-entry back into the universe he started in. As well, Jeffries is planting the seeds for us as viewers to start to engage with both the meta of the series and the deeper existential questions that Lynch is always seeking to ask in all of his work. What is our purpose in life? Who are we? And what is this reality we live in? Is this real or is this dream? And if it's dream, who dreams it? Who controls it? And if we can control this dream, what would we do? And of course, as I'll state again and again throughout my Lynch series, We Live Inside a Dream is a reference to a specific philosopher and is discussing the gift of life and how we experience a collective nature of existence through the limited perception of our individuality. We are like the dreamer who dreams and then lives inside the dream. That is to say, our perception creates our ability to participate in this existence and the collective dream of human life on Earth. Lynch is trying to provoke a broader existentialist perspective with this scene by bludgeoning Dale, Gordon, and Albert with concepts that on the face of it sound almost ridiculous by virtue of their being unready to engage with what they mean. Think of it, I guess, like being not ready to get unplugged from the Matrix, as an analogy for the sort of esoteric message Lynch appears to be getting at. As far as Jeffries discussing the place above the convenience store, this just further substantiates the idea that Jeffries is finding some deeper layer of truth on his journey and is sort of contented with the unreality of his own world and life. I'll discuss the convenience store itself in a later section. Finally, it all wraps back around to Laura Palmer. This is an important detail. Jeffries is on the precipice of a point of no return, where his quest into a deeper knowledge of his own universe is going to lead him somewhere that he can't come back from. This ultimately results in him becoming a part of some machine that is distinctly non-humanoid and resembles a tea kettle by pure. Laura is, interestingly enough, headed down that same path. Long before Cooper can see the spirits that exist in their world, Laura begins seeing them. Mrs. Chalfont and her grandson, Bob, the angel, the fan. Laura is on a path of discovery where she too is approaching the precipice. Just as Dale said to Diane in Part 18, once we cross, it could all be different. Laura seems to be heading there too. And of course she dies for it, but not for that reason alone. Jeffries, Laura, and Dale are all sort of connected by this curiosity and need to figure out some sort of deeper meaning. Laura's quest for a deeper truth is provoked by her trauma and her abuse, as well as other factors I'll discuss later. Jeffries and Dale are provoked primarily by their role as FBI agents. Effectively, Jeffries' scene sets up a number of important details for the series and for this particular entry into the series. Notions of unreality, Lynch's We Live Inside a Dream existentialist philosophy, the notion of differing sides of good and evil within a person, in this case specifically in Dale, and the perils of a necessary existentialist quest into deeper understandings of the world around us. This all sets us up not just for themes that Lynch wanted to explore in the series that he wanted to get to fully expand on until the return, but also for Laura's story, which explores these themes and others within the context of Laura's final days. Laura's story is not just a retelling of the events of her death as recounted in the original show. It's an entirely different beast to the show and a uniquely important piece of the entire series' story and meaning. This is going to be an ordeal, but please join me as we discuss the mystery of Laura Palmer.